Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. How we doing? Breaking Spectre here for an early edition of Midnight Rider on this Sunday. Now the, I believe, 10th day of, or 11th day, I should say, of April, I guess. There we go. Good to have you aboard. We're going to continue here this morning in our quest to get through Ayn Rand's book, The Virtue of Selfishness. So I'll see you back here momentarily. Warning. These social media platforms may be hazardous to your health. Censorship kills. Pain coming. This has been a PSA by Breaking Spectre. Alright, welcome back everybody. Like I said, we're going to continue knocking out old Ayn Rand's The Virtue of Selfishness. Good to have you aboard on this early edition. Hopefully your eyes are open, got the old eggs and bacon frying in the old pan, and definitely get your cup of joe at the ready this morning for this edition. So, that being said, let's just get into it here this morning. And of course, like I said, the old Virtue of Selfishness, you'll be able to find that over on Amazon or whatever your preference is if you wish to follow along. It is the 50th anniversary edition in that I'm reading from, November 1st of 1964. Pick that up wherever you see fit. And where we left off last time, I believe we got all the way through Chapter 1, so we're going to pick up right here on Chapter 2 this morning, Mental Health versus Mysticism and Self-Sacrifice, and see how far we get here, wherever a logical break point is in the next hour, or whatever chapter we can leave off on, so that's what we're going to do. So that being said, let's jump into Chapter 2 here, Mental Health versus Mysticism and Self-Sacrifice. So, the standard of mental health, of biologically appropriate mental functioning, is the same as that of physical health, man's survival and well-being. A mind is healthy to the extent that its method of functioning is such as to provide man with the control over reality that the support and furtherance of his life require. Control over reality, you say, huh? You mean not what the Mockingbird media tells us the reality is? Interesting. The hallmark of this control is self-esteem. Self-esteem is a consequence, expression, and reward of a mind fully committed to reason. Reason, the faculty that identifies and integrates the material provided by the senses, is man's basic tool of survival. Commitment to reason is commitment to the maintenance of a full intellectual focus, to the constant expansion of one's understanding and knowledge, to the principle that one's actions must be consistent with one's convictions, that one must never attempt to fake reality or place any consideration above reality, that one must never permit oneself contradictions, that one must never attempt to subvert or sabotage the proper function of consciousness. The proper function of consciousness is perception, cognition, and the control of action. An unobstructed consciousness, an integrated consciousness, a thinking consciousness, is a healthy consciousness. A blocked consciousness, an evading consciousness, a consciousness torn by conflict and divided against itself, a consciousness disintegrated by fear or immobilized by depression, a consciousness dissociated from reality, is an unhealthy consciousness. For a fuller discussion of this issue, see the chapter entitled Objectivism and Psychology in my book, Who is Ayn Rand? In order to deal with reality successfully, to pursue and achieve the values which his life requires, man needs self-esteem. He needs to be confident of his efficacy and worth. Anxiety and guilt, the antipodes of self-esteem and the insignia of mental illness, are the disintegrators of thought, the distorters of values, and the paralyzers of action. When a man of self-esteem chooses his values and sets his goals, when he projects the long-range purposes that will unify and guide his actions, it is like a bridge thrown to the future, across which his life will pass. A bridge supported by the conviction that his mind is competent to think, to judge, to value, and that he is worthy of enjoying values. This sense of control over reality is not the result of special skills, ability, or knowledge. It is not dependent on particular successes or failures. It reflects one's fundamental relationship to reality, one's conviction of fundamental efficacy and worthiness. It reflects the certainty that, in essence and in principle, one is right for reality. Self-esteem is a metaphysical estimate. It is this psychological state that traditional morality makes impossible to the extent that a man accepts it. Neither mysticism nor the creed of self-sacrifice is compatible with mental health or self-esteem. These doctrines are destructive existentially and psychologically. 1. The maintenance of his life and the achievement of self-esteem require of man the fullest exercise of his reason, but morality, men are taught, rests on and requires faith. Faith is the commitment of one's consciousness to beliefs for which one has no sensory evidence or rational proof. When a man rejects reason as his standard of judgment, only one alternative standard remains to him: his feelings. A mystic is a man who treats his feelings as tools of cognition. Faith is the equation of feeling with knowledge. Aha! Very interesting. You're starting to understand the divide here, folks? To practice the virtue of faith, one must be willing to suspend one's sight and one's judgment. One must be willing to live with the unintelligible, with that which cannot be conceptualized or integrated into the rest of one's knowledge, and to induce a trance-like illusion of understanding. One must be willing to repress one's critical faculty and hold it as one's guilt. One must be willing to drown any questions that rise in protest, to strangle any trust of reason convulsively seeking to assert its proper function as the protector of one's life and cognitive integrity. Remember that all of man's knowledge and all his concepts have a hierarchical structure. The foundation and starting point of man's thinking are his sensory perceptions. On this base, man forms his first concepts, then goes on building the edifice of his knowledge by identifying and integrating new concepts on a wider and wider scale. If man's thinking is to be valid, this process must be guided by logic, the art of non-contradictory identification. And any new concept man forms must be integrated without contradiction into the hierarchical structure of his knowledge. To introduce into one's consciousness any idea that cannot be so integrated, an idea not derived from reality, not validated by a process of reason, not subject to rational examination or judgment, and worse, an idea that clashes with the rest of one's concepts and understanding of reality, is to sabotage the integrative function of consciousness, to undercut the rest of one's convictions, and kill one's capacity to be certain of anything. This is the meaning of John Galt's statement in Atlas Shrugged, that the alleged shortcut to knowledge, which is faith, is only a short circuit destroying the mind. There is no greater self-delusion than to imagine that one can render unto reason that which is reason's, and unto faith that which is faith's. Faith cannot be circumscribed or delimited. To surrender one's consciousness by an inch is to surrender one's consciousness in total. Either reason is an absolute to a mind, or it is not. And if it is not, there is no place to draw the line, no principle by which to draw it, no barrier faith cannot cross, no part of one's life faith cannot invade. One remains rational until and unless one's feelings decree otherwise. Faith is a malignancy that no system can tolerate with impunity, and the man who succumbs to it will call on it in precisely those issues where he needs his reason most. When one turns from reason to faith, when one rejects the absolutism of reality, one undercuts the absolutism of one's consciousness, and one's mind becomes an organ one cannot trust any longer. It becomes what the mystics claim it to be, a tool of distortion. 2. Man's need of self-esteem entails a need for a sense of control over reality, but no control is possible in a universe which, by one's own concession, contains the supernatural, the miraculous, and the causeless, a universe in which one is at the mercy of ghosts and demons, in which one must deal not with the unknown, but with the unknowable. No control is possible if man proposes, but a ghost disposes. No control is possible if the universe is a haunted house. 3. His life and self-esteem require that the object and concern of man's consciousness be reality in this earth, but morality, men are taught, consists of scorning this earth and the world available to sensory perception, and of contemplating, instead, a different and higher reality, a realm inaccessible to reason and incommunicable in language, but attainable by revelation, by special dialectical processes, by that superior state of intellectual lucidity known to Zen Buddhists as no mind, or by death. There is only one reality, the reality knowable to reason, and if man does not choose to perceive it, there is nothing else for him to perceive. If it is not of this world that he is conscious, then he is not conscious at all. The sole result of the mystic projection of another reality is that it incapacitates man psychologically for this one. It was not by contemplating the transcendental, the ineffable, the undefinable, it was not by contemplating the non-existent, that man lifted himself from the cave and transformed the material world to make a human existence possible on earth. If it is a virtue to renounce one's mind, but a sin to use it, if it is a virtue to approximate the mental state of schizophrenic, but a sin to be in intellectual focus, if it is a virtue to denounce this earth, but a sin to make it livable, if it is a virtue to mortify the flesh, but a sin to work and act, if it is a virtue to despise life, but a sin to sustain and enjoy it, then no self-esteem or control or efficacy are possible to man. Nothing is possible to him but the guilt and terror of a wretch caught in a nightmare universe, a universe created by some metaphysical sadist who has cast man into a maze where the door marked virtue leads to self-destruction and the door marked efficacy leads to self-damnation. 4. His life and self-esteem require that man take pride in his power to think, pride in his power to live. But morality, men are taught, holds pride, and specifically intellectual pride, as the gravest of sins. Virtue begins, men are taught, with humility, with a recognition of the helplessness, the smallness, the impotence of one's mind. Is man omniscient? Demands the mystics. Is he infallible? Then how dare he challenge the word of God, or of God's representatives, and set himself up as the judge of anything? Intellectual pride is not, as the mystics preposterously imply it to be, a pretense at omniscience or infallibility. On the contrary, precisely because man must struggle for knowledge, precisely because the pursuit of knowledge requires an effort, the men who assume the responsibility properly feel pride. Sometimes, colloquially, pride is taken to mean a pretense at accomplishments one has not in fact achieved. But the braggart, the boaster, the man who affects virtues he does not possess, is not proud. He has merely chosen the most humiliating way to reveal his humility. Pride is one's response to one's power to achieve values, the pleasure one takes in one's own efficacy. And it is this that mystics hold as evil. But if doubt, not confidence, is man's proper moral state, if self-distrust, not self-reliance, is the proof of his virtue, if fear, not self-esteem, is the mark of perfection, if guilt, not pride, is his goal, then mental illness is a moral ideal. The neurotics and psychotics are the highest exponents of morality, and the thinkers, the achievers, are the sinners, those who are too corrupt and too arrogant to seek virtue and psychological well-being through the belief that they are unfit to exist. Humility is, of necessity, the basic virtue of a mystical morality. It is the only virtue possible to men who have renounced the mind. Pride has to be earned. It is the reward of effort and achievement. But to gain the virtue of humility, one has only to abstain from thinking. Nothing else is demanded, and one will feel humble quickly enough. 5. His life and self-esteem require of man loyalty to his values, loyalty to his mind and its judgments, loyalty to his life. But the essence of morality, men are taught, consists of self-sacrifice, the sacrifice of one's mind to some higher authority, and the sacrifice of one's values to whoever may claim to require it. It is not necessary, in this context, to analyze the almost countless evils entailed by the precept of self-sacrifice. Its irrationality and destructiveness have been thoroughly exposed in Atlas Shrugged. But there are two aspects of the issue that are especially pertinent to the subject of mental health. The first is the fact that self-sacrifice means, and can only mean, mind sacrifice. A sacrifice, it is necessary to remember, means the surrender of a higher value in favor of a lower value or of a non-value. If one gives up that which one does not value in order to obtain that which one does value, or if one gives up a lesser value in order to obtain a greater one, this is not a sacrifice, but a gain. Remember, further, that all of man's values exist in a hierarchy. He values some things more than others, and, to the extent that he is rational, the hierarchical order of his values is rational. That is, he values things in proportion to their importance and serving his life and well-being. That which is inimical to his life and well-being, that which is inimical to his nature and needs, is a living being. He disvalues. Conversely, one of the characteristics of mental illness is a distorted value structure. The neurotic does not value things according to their objective merit, in relation to his nature and needs. He frequently values the very things that will lead him to self-destruction. Judged by objective standards, he is engaged in a chronic process of self-sacrifice. But if sacrifice is a virtue, it is not the neurotic, but the rational man who must be cured. He must learn to do violence to his own rational judgment, to reverse the order of its value hierarchy, to surrender that which his mind has chosen as the good, to turn against and invalidate his own consciousness. Do mystics declare that all they demand of man is that he sacrifice his happiness? To sacrifice one's happiness is to sacrifice one's desires. To sacrifice one's desires is to sacrifice one's values. To sacrifice one's values is to sacrifice one's judgment. To sacrifice one's judgment is to sacrifice one's mind. And it is nothing less than this, that the creed of self-sacrifice aims at and demands. The root of selfishness is man's right, and need, to act on his own judgment. If his judgment is to be an object of sacrifice, what sort of efficacy, control, freedom from conflict, or serenity of spirit will be possible to man? The second aspect that is pertinent here involves not only the creed of self-sacrifice, but all the foregoing tenets of traditional morality. In a rational morality, a morality set in opposition to man's nature, to the facts of reality, and to the requirements of man's survival, necessarily forces men to accept the belief that there is an inevitable clash between the moral and the practical, that they must choose either to be virtuous or to be happy, to be idealistic or to be successful, but they cannot be both. This view establishes a disastrous conflict on the deepest level of man's being, a lethal dichotomy that tears man apart, that forces him to choose between making himself able to live and making himself worthy of living. Yet self-esteem and mental health require that he achieve both. If man holds life on earth as the good, if he judges his values by the standard of that which is proper to the existence of a rational being, then there is no clash between the requirement of survival and of morality, no clash between making himself able to live and making himself worthy of living. He achieves the second by achieving the first. But there is a clash. If man holds the renunciation of this earth as the good, the renunciation of life, of mind, of happiness, of self, under an anti-life morality, man makes himself worthy of living to the extent that he makes himself unable to live. And to the extent that he makes himself able to live, he makes himself unworthy of living. The answer given by many defenders of traditional morality is, "Oh, but people don't have to go to extremes," meaning we don't expect people to be fully moral. We expect them to struggle some self-interest into their lives. We recognize that people have to live after all. The defense, then, of this code of morality is that few people will be suicidal enough to attempt to practice it consistently. Hypocrisy is to be man's protector against his professed moral convictions. What does that do to his self-esteem? And what of the victims who are insufficiently hypocritical? What of the child who withdraws in terror into an autistic universe because he cannot cope with the ravings of parents who tell him that he is guilty by nature, that his body is evil, that thinking is sinful, that question asking is blasphemous, that doubting is depravity, and that he must obey the orders of a supernatural ghost because, if he doesn't, he will burn forever in hell? Or the daughter who collapses in guilt over the sin of not wanting to devote her life to caring for the ailing father, who has given her cause to feel only hatred? Or the adolescent who flees into homosexuality because he has been taught that sex is evil, and that women are to be worshipped, but not desired? Or the businessman who suffers an anxiety attack because, after years of being urged to be thrifty and industrious, he has finally committed the sin of succeeding, and is now told that it shall be easier for the camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven? Or the neurotic who, in hopeless despair, gives up the attempt to solve his problems because he has always heard it preached that this earth is a realm of misery, futility, and doom, where no happiness or fulfillment is possible to man. If the advocates of these doctrines bear a grave moral responsibility, there is a group who perhaps bears a graver responsibility still: the psychologists and psychiatrists who see the human wreckage of these doctrines, but who remain silent and do not protest, who declare that philosophical and moral issues do not concern them, that science cannot pronounce value judgments, who shrug off their professional obligations with the assertion that a rational code of morality is impossible, and, by their silence, lend their sanction to spiritual murder. Very, very interesting. That from March of 1963. Lots to ponder in there, and of course some of the biblical references as well. All right, Chapter 3, The Ethics of Emergencies. This one by Ayn Rand. The psychological results of altruism may be observed in the fact that a great many people approach the subject of ethics by asking such questions as, should one risk one's life to help a man who is A. drowning, B. trapped in a fire, C. stepping in front of a speeding truck, D. hanging by his fingernails over an abyss? Consider the implications of that approach. If a man accepts the ethics of altruism, he suffers the following consequences. in proportion to the degree of his acceptance. 1. Lack of self-esteem. Since his first concern in the realm of values is not how to live his life, but how to sacrifice it. 2. Lack of respect for others, since he regards mankind as a herd of doomed beggars crying for someone's help. 3. A nightmare view of existence, since he believes that men are trapped in a malevolent universe where disasters are the constant and primary concern of their lives. 4. And, in fact, a lethargic indifference to ethics, a hopelessly cynical amorality, since his questions involve situations which he is not likely ever to encounter, which bear no relation to the actual problems of his own life, and thus leave him to live without any moral principles whatever. By elevating the issue of helping others into the central and primary issue of ethics, altruism has destroyed the concept of any authentic benevolence or goodwill among men. It has indoctrinated men with the idea that no value another human being is an act of selflessness, thus implying that a man can have no personal interest in others, that to value another means to sacrifice oneself, that any love, respect, or admiration a man may feel for others is not, and cannot be, a source of his own enjoyment, but is a threat to his existence, a sacrificial blank check signed over to his loved ones. The men who accept that dichotomy, but choose its other side, the ultimate products of altruism's dehumanizing influence, are those psychopaths who do not challenge altruism's basic premise, but proclaim the rebellion against self-sacrifice by announcing that they are totally indifferent to anything living, and would not lift a finger to help a man or a dog left mangled by a hit-and-run driver, who is usually one of their own kind. Most men do not accept or practice either side of altruism's viciously false dichotomy, but its result is a total intellectual chaos on the issue of proper human relationships, and on such questions as the nature, purpose, or extent of the help one may give to others. Today, a great many well-meaning, reasonable men do not know how to identify or conceptualize the moral principles that motivate their love, affection, or goodwill, and can find no guidance in the field of ethics, which is dominated by the stale platitudes of altruism. On the question of why a man is not a sacrificial animal, and why help to others is not his moral duty, I refer you to Atlas Shrugged. This present discussion is concerned with the principles by which one identifies and evaluates the instances involving a man's non-sacrificial help to others. Sacrifice is the surrender of a greater value for the sake of a lesser one or of a non-value. Thus, altruism gauges a man's virtue by the degree to which he surrenders, renounces, or betrays his values, since help to a stranger or an enemy is regarded as more virtuous, less selfish, than help to those one loves. The rational principle of conduct is the exact opposite. Always act in accordance with the hierarchy of your values, and never sacrifice a greater value to a lesser one. This applies to all choices, including one's actions towards other men. It requires that one possess a defined hierarchy of rational values, values chosen and validated by a rational standard. Without such a hierarchy, neither rational conduct nor considered value judgments nor moral choices are possible. Love and friendship are profoundly personal, selfish values. Love is an expression and assertion of self-esteem, a response to one's own values in the person of another. One gains a profoundly personal, selfish joy from the mere existence of the person one loves, if it is one's own personal, selfish happiness that one seeks, earns, and derives from love. A selfless, disinterested love is a contradiction in terms. It means that one is indifferent to that which one values. Concern for the welfare of those who one loves is a rational part of one's selfish interests. If a man who is passionately in love with his wife spends a fortune to cure her of a dangerous illness, it would be absurd to claim that he does it as a sacrifice for her sake, not his own, and that it makes no difference to him, personally and selfishly, whether she lives or dies. Any action that a man undertakes for the benefits of those he loves is not a sacrifice if, in the hierarchy of his values, and the total context of the choices open to him, it achieves that which is of greatest personal and rational importance to him. In the above example, his wife's survival is of greater value to the husband than anything else that his money could buy. It is of greatest importance to his own happiness, and therefore his action is not a sacrifice. But suppose he let her die in order to spend his money on saving the lives of 10 other women, none of whom meant anything to him, as the ethics of altruism would require. That would be a sacrifice. Here, the difference between objectivism and altruism can be seen most clearly. If sacrifice is the moral principle of action, then that husband should sacrifice his wife for the sake of 10 other women. What distinguishes the wife from the 10 others? Nothing but her value to the husband who has to make the choice. Nothing but the fact that his happiness requires her survival. The objectivist ethics would tell him, your highest moral purpose is the achievement of your own happiness. Your money is yours. Use it to save your wife. That is your moral right and your rational moral choice. Consider the soul of the altruistic moralist who would be prepared to tell that husband the opposite, and then ask yourself whether altruism is motivated by benevolence. The proper method of judging when or whether one should help another person is by reference to one's own rational self-interest and one's own hierarchy of values. The time, money, or effort one gives or the risk one takes should be proportionate to the value of the person in relation to one's own happiness. To illustrate this on the altruist's favorite example, the issue of saving a drowning person. If the person to be saved is a stranger, it is morally proper to save him only when the danger to one's own life is minimal. When the danger is great, it would be immoral to attempt it. Only a lack of self-esteem could permit one to value one's life no higher than that of any random stranger. And conversely, if one is drowning, one cannot expect a stranger to risk his life for one's sake, remembering that one's life cannot be as valuable to him as his own. If the person to be saved is not a stranger, then the risk one should be willing to take is greater in proportion to the greatness of that person's value to oneself. If it is the man or woman one loves, then one can be willing to give one's own life to save him or her, for the selfish reason that life without the loved person could be unbearable. Conversely, if a man is able to swim and to save his drowning wife, but becomes panicky, gives in to an unjustified irrational fear, and lets her drown, then spends his life in loneliness and misery, one would not call him selfish. One would condemn him morally for his treason to himself and to his own values, that is, his failure to fight for the preservation of a value crucial to his own happiness. Remember, that values are that which one acts to gain and or keep, and that one's own happiness has to be achieved by one's own effort. Since one's own happiness is the moral purpose of one's life, the man who fails to achieve it because of his own default, because of his failure to fight for it, is morally guilty. The virtue involved in helping those one loves is not selflessness or sacrifice, but integrity. Integrity is loyalty to one's convictions and values. It is the policy of acting in accordance with one's values, of expressing, upholding, and translating them into practical reality. If a man professes to love a woman, yet his actions are indifferent, inimical, or damaging to her, it is his lack of integrity that makes him immoral. The same principle applies to relationships among friends. If one's friend is in trouble, one should act to help him by whatever non-sacrificial means are appropriate. For instance, if one's friend is starving, it is not a sacrifice, but an act of integrity to give him money for food rather than buy some insignificant gadget for oneself, because his welfare is important in the scale of one's personal values. If the gadget means more than the friend's suffering, one had no business pretending to be his friend. The practical implementation of friendship, affection, and love consists of incorporating the welfare, the rational welfare, of the person involved into one's own hierarchy of values, then acting accordingly. But this is a reward which men have to earn by means of their virtues, and which one cannot grant to mere acquaintances or strangers. What, then, should one properly grant to strangers? The generalized respect and goodwill which one should grant to a human being in the name of the potential value he represents, until and unless he forfeits it. A rational man does not forget that life is a source of all value, and, as such, a common bond among living beings, as against inanimate matter, that other men are potentially able to achieve the same virtues as his own, and thus be of enormous value to him. This does not mean that he regards human lives as interchangeable with his own. He recognizes the fact that his own life is the source, not only of all his values, but of his capacity to value. Therefore, the value he grants to others is only a consequence, an extension, a secondary projection of the primary value which is himself. The respect and goodwill that men of self-esteem feel toward other human beings is profoundly egoistic. They feel, in effect, other men are of value because they are of the same species as myself. In revering living entities, they are revering their own life. This is a psychological base of any emotion of sympathy and any feeling of species solidarity. Since men are born tabula rasa, both cognitively and morally, a rational man regards strangers as innocent until proven guilty, and grants them that initial good will in the name of their human potential. After that, he judges them according to the moral character they have actualized. If he finds them guilty of major evils, his goodwill is replaced by contempt and moral condemnation. If one values human life, one cannot value its destroyers. If he finds them to be virtuous, he grants them personal, individual value and appreciation in proportion to their virtues. It is on the ground of that generalized goodwill and respect for the value of human life that one helps strangers in an emergency, and only in an emergency. It is important to differentiate between the rules of conduct in an emergency situation and the rules of conduct in the normal conditions of human existence. This does not mean a double standard of morality. The standard and the basic principles remain the same, but their application to either case requires precise definitions. An emergency is an unchosen, unexpected event, limited in time, that creates conditions under which human survival is impossible, such as a flood, an earthquake, a fire, a shipwreck. In an emergency situation, man's primary goal is to combat the disaster, escape the danger, and restore normal conditions, to reach dry land, to put out the fire, etc. By normal conditions, I mean metaphysically normal. Normal in the nature of things, and appropriate to human existence. Men can live on land, but not in water or in a raging fire. Since men are not omnipotent, it is metaphysically possible for unforeseeable disasters to strike them, in which case their only task is to return to those conditions under which their lives can continue. By its nature, an emergency situation is temporary. If it were to last, men would perish. It is only in emergency situations that one should volunteer to help strangers, if it is in one's power. For instance, a man who values human life and is caught in a shipwreck should help to save his fellow passengers, though not at the expense of his own life. But this does not mean that after they all reach shore, he should devote his efforts to saving his fellow passengers from poverty, ignorance, neurosis, or whatever other troubles they might have. Nor does it mean that he should spend his life sailing the 7 seas in search of shipwreck victims to save. Or, to take an example that can occur in everyday life, Suppose one hears that the man next door is ill and penniless. Illness and poverty are not metaphysical emergencies. They are part of the normal risks of existence. But since the man is temporarily helpless, one may bring him food and medicine, if one can afford it, as an act of goodwill, not of duty. Or one may raise a fund among the neighbors to help him out. But this does not mean that one must support him from then on, nor that one must spend one's life looking for starving men to help. In the normal conditions of existence, man has to choose his goals, project them in time, pursue them, and achieve them by his own effort. He cannot do it if his goals are at the mercy of and must be sacrificed to any misfortune happening to others. He cannot live his life by the guidance of rules applicable only to conditions under which human survival is impossible. The principle that one should help man in an emergency cannot be extended to regard all human suffering as an emergency, and to turn the misfortune of some into a first mortgage on the lives of others. Poverty, ignorance, illness, and other problems of that kind are not metaphysical emergencies. By the metaphysical nature of man and of existence, man has to maintain his life by his own effort. The values he needs, such as wealth or knowledge, are not given to him automatically, as a gift of nature, but have to be discovered and achieved by his own thinking and work. One's sole obligation toward others, in this respect, is to maintain a social system that leaves men free to achieve, to gain, and to keep their values. Every code of ethics is based on and derived from a metaphysics, that is, from a theory about the fundamental nature of the universe in which man lives and acts. The altruist ethics is based on a malevolent universe. Metaphysics on the theory that man, by his very nature, is helpless and doomed, that success, happiness, achievement are impossible to him, that emergencies, disasters, catastrophes are the norm of his life, and that his primary goal is to combat them. As the simplest empirical refutation of that metaphysics, as evidence of the fact that the material universe is not inimical to man, and that catastrophes are the exception, not the rule of his existence, observe the fortunes made by insurance companies. Observe also that the advocates of altruism are unable to base their ethics on any facts of men's normal existence, and that they always offer lifeboat situations as examples from which to derive the rules of moral conduct. What should you do if you and another man are in a lifeboat that can carry only one, etc.? The fact is that men do not live in lifeboats, and that a lifeboat is not the place on which to base one's metaphysics. The moral purpose of a man's life is the achievement of his own happiness. This does not mean that he is indifferent to all men, that human life is of no value to him, and that he has no reason to help others in an emergency. But it does mean that he does not subordinate his life to the welfare of others, that he does not sacrifice himself to their needs, that the relief of their suffering is not his primary concern, that any help he gives is an exception, not a rule, an act of generosity, not of moral duty, that it is a marginal and incidental, as disasters are marginal and incidental in the course of human existence, and that values, not disasters, are the goal, the first concern and the motive power of his life. Interesting. That from February 1963. Kind of gives you a new, perhaps, perspective on the old Good Samaritan, right? All right, into Chapter 4, the conflicts of men's interest. So some students of objectivism find it difficult to grasp the objectivist principle that there are no conflicts of interest among rational men. A typical question runs as follows. Suppose two men apply for the same job. Only one of them can be hired. Isn't this an instance of a conflict of interest? And isn't the benefit of one man achieved at the price of the sacrifice of the other? There are four interrelated considerations which are involved in a rational man's view of his interests. but which are ignored or evaded in the above question, and in all similar approaches to the issue. I shall designate these four as A. Reality, B. Context, C. Responsibility, and D. Effort. A. Reality. The term interest is a wide abstraction that covers the entire field of ethics. It includes the issues of man's values, his desires, his goals, and their actual achievements in reality. A man's interest depends on the kind of goals he chooses to pursue. His choice of goals depends on his desires. His desire depends on his values. And, for a rational man, his values depend on the judgment of his mind. Desires, or feelings, or emotions, or wishes, or whims, are not tools of cognition. They are not a valid standard of value, nor a valid criterion of man's interests. The mere fact that a man desires something does not constitute a proof that the object of his desire is good, nor that its achievement is actually to his interest. To claim that a man's interests are sacrificed whenever a desire of his is frustrated is to hold a subjectivist view of man's values and interests, which means to believe that it is proper, moral, and possible for man to achieve his goals, regardless of whether they contradict the facts of reality or not, which means to hold an irrational or mystical view of existence, which means to deserve no further consideration. In choosing his goals, the specific values he seeks to gain and or keep, a rational man is guided by his thinking, by a process of reason, not by his feelings or desires. He does not regard desires as irreducible primaries, as the given, which he is destined irresistibly to pursue. He does not regard because I want it or because I feel like it as a sufficient cause and validation of his actions. He chooses and or identifies his desires by a process of reason, and he does not act to achieve a desire until and unless he is able rationally to validate it in the full context of his knowledge and of his other values and goals. He does not act until he is able to say, I want it because it is right. The law of identity, A, is a rational man's paramount consideration in the process of determining his interests. He knows that the contradictory is the impossible, that a contradiction cannot be achieved in reality, and that the attempt to achieve it can only lead to disaster and destruction. Therefore, he does not permit himself to hold contradictory values, to pursue contradictory goals, or to imagine that the pursuit of a contradiction can ever be to his interest. Only an irrationalist, or mystic, or subjectivist, in which category I place all those who regard faith, feelings, or desires as man's standard of value, exists in a perpetual conflict of interests. Not only do his alleged interests clash with those of other men, but they clash also with one another. No one finds it difficult to dismiss from philosophical consideration the problem of a man who wails that life entraps him in an irreconcilable conflict because he cannot eat his cake and have it too. That problem does not acquire intellectual validity by being expanded to involve more than cake, whether one expands it to the whole universe, as in the doctrines of existentialism, or only to a few random whims and evasions, as in most people's views of their interests. When a person reaches a stage of claiming that man's interest conflicts with reality, the concept interest ceases to be meaningful, and his problem ceases to be philosophical and becomes psychological. B. Context. Just as a rational man does not hold any conviction out of context, that is, without relating it to the rest of his knowledge and resolving any possible contradictions, so he does not hold or pursue any desire out of context, and he does not judge what is or is not to his interest out of context, on the range of any given moment. Context dropping is one of the chief psychological tools of evasion. In regard to one's desires, there are two major ways of context dropping: the issues of range and of means. A rational man sees his interests in terms of a lifetime and selects his goals accordingly. This does not mean that he has to be omniscient, infallible, or clairvoyant. It means that he does not live his life short range and does not drift like a bum pushed by the spur of the moment. It means that he does not regard any moment as cut off from the context of the rest of his life, and that he allows no conflicts or contradictions between his short-range and long-range interests. He does not become his own destroyer by pursuing a desire today which wipes out all his values tomorrow. A rational man does not indulge in wistful longings for ends divorced from means. He does not hold a desire without knowing or learning and considering the means by which it is to be achieved, since he knows that nature does not provide man with the automatic satisfaction of his desires, that a man's goals or values have to be achieved by his own effort, that the lives and efforts of other men are not his property and are not there to serve his wishes. A rational man never holds a desire or pursues a goal which cannot be achieved directly or indirectly by his own effort. It is with a proper understanding of this indirectly that the crucial social issues begins. Living in a society instead of on a desert island does not relieve a man of the responsibility of supporting his own life. The only difference is that he supports his life by trading his products or services for the products or services of others. And in this process of trade, a rational man does not seek or desire any more or any less than his own effort can earn. What determines his earnings? The free market, that is, the voluntary choice and judgment of the men who are willing to trade him their effort in return. When a man trades with others, he is counting, explicitly or implicitly, on their rationality, that is, on their ability to recognize the objective value of his work. A trade based on any other premise is a con game or a fraud. Thus, when a rational man pursues a goal in a free society, he does not place himself at the mercy of whims, the favors, or the prejudices of others. He depends on nothing but his own effort, directly, by doing objectively valuable work, indirectly, through the objective evaluation of his work by others. It is in this sense that a rational man never holds a desire or pursues a goal which cannot be achieved by his own effort. He trades value for value. He never seeks or desires the unearned. If he undertakes to achieve a goal that requires the cooperation of many people, he never counts on anything but his own ability to persuade them and their voluntary agreement. Needless to say, a rational man never distorts or corrupts his own standards and judgment in order to appeal to the irrationality, stupidity, or dishonesty of others. He knows that such a course is suicidal. He knows that one's only practical chance to achieve any degree of success or anything humanly desirable lies in dealing with those who are rational, whether there are many of them or few. If, in any given set of circumstances, any victory is possible at all, it is only reason that can win it. And, in a free society, no matter how hard the struggle might be, it is reason that ultimately wins. Since he never drops the context of the issues he deals with, a rational man accepts that struggle as to his interest because he knows that freedom is to his interest. He knows that the struggle to achieve his values includes the possibility of defeat. He knows also that there is no alternative and no automatic guarantee of success for man's effort, neither in dealing with nature nor with other men. So he does not judge his interest by any particular defeat, nor by the range of any particular moment. He lives and judges long range, and he assumes the full responsibility of knowing what conditions are necessary for the achievement of his goals. C. Responsibility. This last is a particular form of intellectual responsibility that most people evade. That evasion is a major cause of their frustrations and defeats. Most people hold their desires without any context whatever, as ends hanging in a foggy vacuum, the fog hiding any concept of means. They rouse themselves mentally only long enough to utter an "I wish" and stop there and wait, as if the rest were up to some unknown power. What they evade is the responsibility of judging the social world. They take the world as the given. A world they never made is the deepest essence of their attitude, and they seek only to adjust themselves uncritically to the incomprehensible requirements of those unknowable others who did make the world, whoever those might be. But humility and presumptuousness are two sides of the same psychological medal. In the willingness to throw oneself blindly on the mercy of others, there is the implicit privilege of making blind demands on one's masters. There are countless ways in which this sort of metaphysical humility reveals itself. For instance, there is the man who wishes to be rich, but never thinks of discovering what means, actions, and conditions are required to achieve wealth. Who is he to judge? He never made the world, and nobody gave him a break. There is the girl who wishes to be loved, but never thinks of discovering what love is, what values it requires, and whether she possesses any virtues to be loved for. Who is she to judge? Love, she feels, is an inexplicable favor, so she merely longs for it, feeling that somebody has deprived her of her share in the distribution of favors. There are the parents who suffer deeply and genuinely because their son or daughter does not love them, and who simultaneously ignore, oppose, or attempt to destroy everything they know of their son's convictions, values, and goals, never thinking of the connection between these two facts, never making an attempt to understand their son. The world they never made and dare not challenge has told them that children love parents automatically. There is the man who wants a job, but never thinks of discovering what qualifications the job requires, or what constitutes doing one's work well. Who is he to judge? He never made the world. Somebody owes him a living. How? Somehow. A European architect of my acquaintance was talking one day of his trip to Puerto Rico. He described with great indignation at the universe at large the squalor of the Puerto Ricans' living conditions. Then he described what wonders modern housing could do for them, which he had daydreamed in detail, including electric refrigerators and tiled bathrooms. I asked who would pay for it. He answered, in a faintly offended, almost huffy tone of voice, "Oh, that's not for me to worry about. An architect's task is only to project what should be done. Let somebody else think about the money." That is a psychology from which all social reforms, or welfare states, or noble experiments, or the destruction of the world have come. In dropping the responsibility for one's own interests and life, one drops the responsibility of ever having to consider the interests and lives of others, of those others who are, somehow, to provide the satisfaction of one's desires. Whoever allows a somehow into his view of the means by which his desires are to be achieved is guilty of that metaphysical humility, which psychologically is a premise of a parasite. As Nathaniel Branden pointed out in a lecture, somehow always means somebody. The effort. Since a rational man knows that man must achieve his goals by his own effort, he knows that neither wealth nor jobs nor any human values exist in a given, limited, static quantity, waiting to be divided. He knows that all benefits have to be produced, that the gain of one man does not represent the loss of another, that a man's achievement is not earned at the expense of those who have not achieved it. Therefore, he never imagines that he has any sort of unearned unilateral claim on any human being, and he never leaves his interests at the mercy of any one person or single specific concrete. He may need clients, but not any one particular customer. He may need a job, but not any one particular job. If he encounters competition, he either meets it or chooses another line of work. There is no job so slow that a better, more skillful performance of it would pass unnoticed and unappreciated. Not in a free society. Ask any office manager. It is only the passive, parasitical representatives of the humility metaphysics school who regard any competitor as a threat, because the thought of earning one's position by personal merit is not part of their view of life. They regard themselves as interchangeable mediocrities, who have nothing to offer and who fight in a static universe for someone's causeless favor. A rational man knows that one does not live by means of luck, breaks, or favors, that there is no such thing as only chance, or a single opportunity, and that this is guaranteed precisely by the existence of competition. He does not regard any concrete, specific goal or value as irreplaceable. He knows that only persons are irreplaceable, only those one loves. He knows also that there are no conflicts of interest among rational men, even in the issue of love. Like any other value, love is not a static quantity to be divided, but an unlimited response to be earned. The love for one friend is not a threat to the love for another, and neither is the love for the various members of one's family, assuming they have earned it. The most exclusive form, romantic love, is not an issue of competition. If two men are in love with the same woman, what she feels for either of them is not determined by what she feels for the other, and is not taken away from him. If she chooses one of them, the loser could not have had what the winner has earned. It is only among the irrational, emotion-motivated persons, whose love is divorced from any standards of value, that chance rivalries, accidental conflicts, and blind choices prevail. But then, whoever wins does not win much. Among the emotion-driven, neither love nor any other emotion has any meaning. Such, in brief essence, are the four major considerations involved in a rational man's view of his interests. Now, let us return to the question originally asked, about the two men applying for the same job, and observe in what manner it ignores or opposes these four considerations. A. Reality. The mere fact that two men desire the same job does not constitute proof that either of them is entitled to it, or deserves it, and that his interests are damaged if he does not obtain it. B. Context. Both men should know that if they desire a job, their goal is made possible only by the existence of a business concern able to provide employment, that business concern requires the availability of more than one applicant for any job, that if only one applicant existed, he would not obtain the job because the business concern would have to close its doors, and that their competition for the job is to their interest, even though one of them will lose in that particular encounter. Responsibility. Neither man has the moral right to declare that he doesn't want to consider all those things. He just wants a job. He is not entitled to any desire or to any interest without knowledge of what is required to make its fulfillment possible. D. Effort. Whoever gets the job has earned it, assuming that the employer's choice is rational. This benefit is due to his own merit, not to the sacrifice of the other man who never had any vested right to that job. The failure to give to a man what had never belonged to him can hardly be described as sacrificing his interests. All the above discussion applies only to the relationships among rational men, and only to a free society. In a free society, one does not have to deal with those who are irrational, one who is free to avoid them. In a non-free society, no pursuit of any interest is possible to anyone. Nothing is possible but gradual and general destruction. That from 1962. And I think that's probably a good spot to stop here, at least for the moment. Lots to consider there. And of course, those closing statements talking about a free versus a non-free society. Do you see the parallels playing out? The fact that we just had a case of where Delta Airlines decides that, we have to have diversity and everything else, diversity and inclusion on how we select our pilots now, rather than over the course of choosing rationally who actually has merits for the job, right? Just one example. And I'm sure you can see the parallels in many other examples in our society today on how this plays out. it's nuts. The fact that we have the rational amongst the irrational making the choices at the moment. And so, again, hence why we're going through this, and I'm sure many of you will be able to see the parallels as well. So, that being said, that is going to do it for this episode here. We will come back to this here at a later point in time. Otherwise, I should be over on the 5x5 channel here this afternoon for the roundtable. You can join me over there. Otherwise, have a blessed day. Get out, get to your fellow churches and whatnot, and have a little fellowship with folks while you still can in our last vestiges of a free society, as it were. But that being said, we'll see you back here a little bit later on. Take care. God bless everybody.